5 Live Formula One.
Yes, hello and welcome to 5 Live F1. Now, after the Canadian Grand Prix 2 weeks ago, you might be thinking it's all gone a bit quiet on the F1 front. But don't you worry, we've got 5 races in 6 weekends. It's the start of the European season and it all begins in Barcelona, Spain. I am delighted to say I'm joined by Andrew Benson and Jolyon Palmer. And Jolyon, is this a good place, a good race?
Spain's nice. It feels like we've had a few funky weekends. We've had Monaco, we've had Montreal. It's been a lot of fun, hasn't it? We've had different winners. It's been unbelievably close racing. We're off the back of a humdinger of a Grand Prix. So I don't know if I'm feeling the absolute love for the prospect of coming to the Spanish Grand Prix right now, which has not always been a classic, but let's give it its dues. It's a nice circuit. There's a couple of star Spanish drivers still in the field as well. So, yeah, it's nice.
I'm a little bit worried this weekend, Jenny, that we've had, as Jolyon says, we've had some great races. The last few races, Miami, Lando Norris took his first victory there. In Imola, he pushed Verstappen all the way, finished less than a second behind him. In Monaco, we had Charles Leclerc winning for Ferrari. Canada was a great race between Russell and Norris and Verstappen. Verstappen came out on top. Almost by virtue of making fewer mistakes, him and Red Bull, than everybody else. But they've all been particular kinds of circuits, and I'm a bit worried that Barcelona, which is the sort of classic car test circuit, if you like, might bring us back to what we got at the beginning of the year, which was, Verstappen, which would be a shame because it's been so interesting and competitive recently. But I could be wrong because McLaren have been upgrading their car. Ferrari have got upgrades this weekend. Probably everybody's going to have upgrades this weekend when we see the data sheet tomorrow morning. So it could be a Red Bull benefit, but on the other hand, it's not. And I think if it isn't, then that bodes really well for the rest of the year. Because,
Jolyon, Spain is very much, as Andrew was saying, the place where everyone goes testing, or it used to be. Everyone's done miles and miles and miles in their sims of driving around Barcelona. Why is that? Why did they use this track as a gauge for everything else?
Because it's not a particularly long lap and it's got a lot of range of corners. It's got a lot of long, fast corners, so you can see the aerodynamics on the car in the most stable state. It's a decent track surface. It's not really bumpy. And yeah, I used to do so many laps on the simulator. It would just be Barcelona, basically, because it was a good approximation of the calendar. And yeah, you can see the airflow, the downforce working well. And it used to have quite a blend of corners as well. There would be the tight left-hander at turn 10, some slow speed, a fiddly chicane at the end of the lap. But actually, we're starting, as Andrew says, 5 races in 6 weeks. And I think these are now becoming outlier races with the way that the calendar's moving. You're getting your Miamis on, following, Baku came on a while ago. Jeddah's on the calendar now. Vegas is on the calendar now. Long straights, more bumpy circuits, more street circuit feel of the calendar. So you're losing the European heartland. And we don't even go testing in Barcelona anymore for good measure as well. That's now Bahrain, which is probably where your middle ground approximation of a Formula One racetrack in 2024 is.
And actually, that's a point that Carlos Sainz was making in the press conference just a few minutes ago before we started this recording. He was saying that actually, the Bakus and the Miamis, they're more like your sort of standard issue Formula One track now, with slower corners, shorter duration corners. Barcelona and Silverstone, Spa, they are kind of outliers. And you think about, we have got a bunch of them coming up in a row now, with Spain, then Austria, then Silverstone, then Hungary, and then Spa, all one after the other before the summer break. All similar sorts of circuits, flowing, classic European road courses. But actually, as Jolyon says, if you look at the balance of the calendar, it's not really like this anymore. But that's all the more reason to think that these are the sorts of races where Red Bull and Max Verstappen might stretch their legs. The tracks that Formula One's been on recently, slower corners, curb riding in most of them. Those are not strengths of the Red Bull, as we discovered very much so in Monaco, where they had a very difficult weekend. That's not such an issue anymore at these next 4 or 5 races. But it's also fair to say it's not really an issue at Imola, and they were pushed all the way at Imola as well. So that's what I mean about the uncertainty. It could almost be a defining race for the season, if you like, now, because we've got these 5 quickish European circuits coming up. If Verstappen dominates in Spain, risk is he might dominate all those races. Then the championship's basically over before we get to the summer break.
Oh, no.
Andrew. Here comes Doommonger Benson.
If it's close this weekend, like it was in Imola, then I'm not saying Verstappen's not going to win the championship, because I think he is. But then we've got a real humdinger of a season in terms of race-to-race competitiveness coming up.
And I don't think the picture's as bleak as you sort of paint it could be, because we were off the back of 2 races. Okay, so we turned up to Monaco, and I don't think anyone expected Verstappen to take pole and win, and he didn't. He struggled a bit. The same for Canada. I don't think we expected, we thought he'd be in the mix because he always is, but I don't think we expected him to take pole and win. And he didn't take pole, and he did win, but it was through so many things, and it was a very complex race. I imagine he's the favourite heading into this weekend. I think he's probably most people's favourite, but you look at the picture as well for other teams. McLaren, they're going to be licking their lips as well at this run of races. Lots of long, fast corners where they've been brilliant. Norris qualified 3rd here last year. That was when the McLaren was a dog.
Yeah, that was
before the
pre-upgrade.
upgrades. Yeah, and he was 3rd. This is a team that always likes long, fast corners, and they've actually been good through the Mickey Mouse stuff and the bumps as well. They're showing that they can be a bit of an all-rounder with their car and their drivers. And I think McLaren are going to be thinking, hey, this is our chance to go and fight Red Bull, as they did in Imola as well, where there's fast corners and not such a bumpy circuit. I think they're going to be confident. And also Ferrari, who are not particularly strong on the straights right now. There's one whopping long straight in Barcelona, particularly now you come out of the final corner really quickly. But the rest of it could even suit them a little bit more as well. So I think McLaren particularly are going to be the team thinking there could be a chance. Also,
it's a real acid test for Mercedes, Jolien, isn't it? They've put a series of upgrades on that car over the last few races. And okay, Montreal's a very specific kind of circuit, but they've been saying in this run of races, we think we're understanding the car now. We think we're getting to a place where we know. Yeah, exactly. Finally, after 2+ years. We think we're getting to a place where we understand how to put performance on it. We think we can perform across a balance of corners now. This is going to be a real test for them on that front this weekend. Can they do that? And if they can, then they could be in the mix too, just like they were in Montreal.
They've been a bit the boy that cried Toto Wolff, haven't they, recently, for the last couple of years.
How long have you been working on that, Jolien?
Oh, yeah, it's genius. Finally, I can say it. No, but they have, for a good 2 years, they've been saying, oh, well, now we understand it. I remember turning up to Miami in 2022. This is 5 races into their zero-pod failed concept car. And I think Russell topped one of the Friday practice sessions, and they said, guys, bingo, we've got it. And then you fast forward the end of that year, they hadn't got it. Fast forward to the end of last year, okay, they were a bit better, they hadn't got it. They had a new concept and they turned up to Bahrain. Guys, bingo, we've got it. They haven't got it. So now we've had Canada. Guys, bingo, we've got it. And you're like, okay, look, you could have won the race in Canada, and they did take pole, and generally I thought it was a good team performance. But have they actually got it? Or were the circumstances kind to them in Canada, and on a very different circuit, they'll be back to being a little bit confused?
Well, that's the point. Race. We're going to find out, aren't we? And that's, I think, what's so fascinating about this race weekend from their point of view.
And they've always been good here as well, in Barcelona.
Absolutely. I mean, Verstappen does lead the championship by 56 points. Red Bull lead by 49 points. It could have been much larger than that, their lead, over all the other teams. Do you see that?
If they had a second driver who could drive the car properly, you mean?
I wasn't going to point and say that, but you said it, so that's on you. But it could be a lot different. Do you think, Jolien, that lead is going to be extended from now on for the next 6 races? Because, as you say, these look like Verstappen tracks. They look like Red Bull tracks.
It's difficult to see how Verstappen won't increase that lead over the next handful of races until the summer break. If I were Max, I'd be more worried about Norris than Leclerc, I think, for the championship. I think McLaren have shown a bit more of an all-round package, and I think across different tracks and conditions, I think they're probably better. But then we're talking about a guy that's never been in the top 3-4 of a championship, being Verstappen's nearest threat from 50 points back. Verstappen, I think, is going to be champion, and he'll only cement that with the caveat that a very unlucky couple of races, and it might tense him up. But he's so good, and Canada was the perfect example of why Verstappen is a champion, because there are so many things that can go wrong, and yet in these melee races, he's always going to be there. The one I'm more interested in is Red Bull and the constructors, because Perez has been woeful recently, really, and he's in probably his worst rut that he's ever been in at Red Bull, and he's had some ruts. So he needs to bounce back. I think the Red Bull management, having just signed him, need him to bounce back to save a bit of face as well, because that was embarrassing for the whole team. The way that Checo was in qualifying and then sort of limped out of the race. So I think the constructors is the battle that we can enjoy for this year.
With Perez, what can the team do to support him? How much will they try and support him? Because obviously, as you say, this is becoming a slightly awkward situation for them, and he needs to start delivering that second place support for Verstappen.
Honestly, I don't know why they re-signed him. I think, I've got a good idea why they re-signed him, and it's purely to keep Verstappen happy. But is that the cost that you want to have such a gulf between your two drivers? So that I can't remember the last race where Max wasn't winning or in victory contention, and he wasn't flanked by both Ferraris, both McLarens, possibly a Mercedes. And you're thinking, where on earth is Sergio Perez in the same car? I think it was back to China, and even then Norris got in between them. So for Red Bull, they should have given him the confidence, really, with everything they're doing behind the scenes. They are helping him out. They've re-signed him, which is confidence enough to say, we're keeping you not just for 1 year, but 2 years. But when you're in a rut, you're struggling to see the wood from the trees, you're getting into a practice session, one thing goes badly and you spiral down and you're overdriving and it gets worse. And he just needs to try and go back to basics and pick up a 5th place in a Grand Prix again.
I think actually, Jenny, excuse me, there's not a fix for this, because basically Perez is 2 to 3 tenths of a second slower than Max Verstappen. And the field is close enough now that there's a number of cars that are within that performance margin of Verstappen and Red Bull, that combination. So if you've got both McLaren drivers, both Ferrari drivers, and both Mercedes drivers within 2 or 3 tenths of Verstappen, they're going to be ahead of Perez. That's just the natural order of things. And I think it also raises a really interesting question. And I think it can't be answered, this question, until we've had the next run of races. But is the Red Bull still the best car? Because if you walk around the paddock and talk to the team bosses, I've had a couple of very senior people in Formula One this year say to me, I think Verstappen's got 2 or 3 tenths on everybody as a driver. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that's a view that very senior bosses in Formula One have expressed. If that's the case, and it's a big if, then the Red Bull's not the best car anymore. Interesting question, I think, at least.
I always find it fascinating when the second Red Bull driver, which has happened in the last 5 years or so, has been out-qualified by an AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, an RB, whatever you call them. When Tsunoda's charging in 8th place qualifiers, Ricciardo was 5th on the grid in Canada. You think if you put Verstappen in that car, is Verstappen taking pole with this machine? When Perez is 5, 6, 7 places behind the RB, that it does sort of adds to the question and the thought that is it just that when the RBs are better than Sergio Perez, who's not a shabby driver, he's a solid midfielder, and yet he's being beaten by Tsunoda, by Ricciardo in the second car, could Verstappen be winning in that?
I actually don't think that Verstappen has 3 tenths on everybody, by the way. Other people have said that. I don't believe that he's 3 tenths quicker than Leclerc on a qualifying lap, for example. I don't believe he's 3 tenths quicker than Hamilton or Russell or Norris. He might be quicker than them all, but not by that much. So for me, it's what Jolene says. It's an interesting question, but probably not would be my answer. But I do think that from the second Red Bull driver point of view, they are now in a very sticky situation. And that's why I think Jolyon's right. Why did they sign Perez? Because if you look at the average qualifying gap between Verstappen and Perez over the time they've been teammates, that's about what it is. And if the field's this close, Perez is going to be qualifying behind all those other cars. That's just the way it is.
Do you both guys think that with everything that's going on at Red Bull, the awkwardness, the people leaving, the uncomfortable situation, that actually Red Bull needed to keep Perez just to keep the ship sailing?
No, you don't need to keep Sergio Perez to keep your ship on the right course when you've got a problem because your team boss has been accused of sexual harassment by a female employee. He denies that, of course, Christian Horner. It has led to Adrian Newey leaving. That's a massive blow to them. And Verstappen's position in that team is still in question for the long term anyway, post 2025 probably we're talking about. There's a chance of him moving somewhere else. Mercedes are trying everything they can to get hold of him for 26. But keeping the second driver is not the way that you keep a team like that on an even keel.
The only way is if they've managed to amend Verstappen's contract or lock him in until the end of his existing contract.
They haven't. He's got an out for sure.
And if they haven't managed to change that out, then all they've done is ensure that if Verstappen leaves, they're in big trouble because they haven't signed. So always with this, it's with the knowledge that Carlos Sainz is on the market as a potential second driver. He's the only driver I think that would make sense for Red Bull really to replace Perez with at this stage. And if Verstappen were to leave for 26, so he's got another year and then he leaves, you've got all your big name drivers are signed to other teams. So where on earth do Red Bull go to try and get one, pay a lot of money to pinch maybe a McLaren driver? But McLaren drivers even want to go to Red Bull at that stage? They've left themselves really open by having such a big gulf between their two drivers that if the main one leaves, they could be left with two average in the context of Formula One drivers.
And we should talk about Adrian Newey now as well, because obviously he has announced he is leaving the team. He will stop working for the team at the beginning of next year. Do we have any more indication of where this great master of aerodynamics and car design will go? Because he has said he will go somewhere within F1.
So we don't have any more indication, Jenny. There's a couple of stories around this week about him having had a tour of the Aston Martin factory. I'm pretty sure he'll have had some tours of the other factories of the teams that are interested in him as well. Ferrari are very, very keen to have him. McLaren are in the game as well. And I think it's between those three, basically. I think Aston Martin are very much outsiders from what I've been told about the situation. So it's that would make it basically between Ferrari and McLaren. And for Newey, that then becomes a decision between money, first of all, because Ferrari will definitely offer him more money than McLaren. And also they offer him something that he's never had before, which is to work for Ferrari and work with Lewis Hamilton, potentially have the opportunity to become even more of a legend than he already is by turning Ferrari into world champions again, or a much more stable, less disruptive situation at McLaren where, okay, he's been at McLaren before, although it's a very different team now, no Ron Dennis, for example, which is why Newey left from McLaren in the first place, because he got annoyed by the way they were trying to manage him. Zach Brown, now the CEO there, of course, but it's down the road from his house. It doesn't disrupt his domestic life as much. Of course, he'll be worried about his wife and having to commute to Italy some of the time if he was moving to Ferrari. So that's what he's weighing up effectively. Lawrence Stroll, the Aston Martin owner, is also desperate to have him, but I'm told that that's not it's the third ranked horse, if you like, out of the contenders.
Jolyon, do you think he'd be lured by the money of Ferrari or the stability, I suppose, of McLaren?
I don't think it's the money that would lure him to Ferrari. I think it's the prospect of
the kudos.
It's the kudos. If you're Adrian Newey, 65 years old, he has achieved so many championships. He gets so much praise as well because he has built rocket ship after rocket ship in his career. He's now 65. The next one could well be the final roll of the dice for him. He's never worked for Ferrari. He's worked at McLaren. He's worked, obviously, at Red Bull for a long time as well. He's worked at Williams and built a championship-winning team there as well. But he's never worked outside of the UK. To work for Ferrari, the most historic team still in Formula One. To go and work with Lewis Hamilton, probably the most historic driver in Formula One, who's on his final roll of the dice as well. And you've got the prospect of Charles Leclerc, who's still, people would say, could be the quickest driver in Formula One. You're a designer. That's a mouth-watering prospect. I don't think it's the money that would lure him there. The money might mean he doesn't go there if someone else can offer an eye-watering amount, but I don't think Adrian's chasing the money at his age. He is a very rich man. And for him, he's a racer. He wants to achieve something special. And he wants, I think, as well, to work with the most respected drivers in the world. And he has worked with them in the past. I know he's a big fan of Fernando Alonso, who he's never worked with. Obviously, that's a slight lure towards Aston Martin and to try and give Fernando a car that could possibly win another championship. But you got the chance to go and work with Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari. I still feel that's too big opportunity for Adrian Newey to turn down.
I mean, his manager, Eddie Jordan, we now know from that press release. What will Eddie be telling him? Because we've both worked with Eddie. His
EGL wanted to take whatever the biggest offer is, for sure.
Yeah.
So he will be swayed by the money.
No question.
Talking about Lewis Hamilton, the pull of Lewis Hamilton, is that still the great pull of Lewis Hamilton? He's started this season not how anyone would have thought he would. George Russell's got the better of him. Andrew, what's going on with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes at the moment?
I honestly don't know. It's really interesting, Jenny, isn't it? And he said something very interesting after Canada about needing to get his head right to get his performance back on track effectively. I'm paraphrasing there. That's not an exact quote, but the head aspect of it is definitely what he was referring to. And it's only a couple of races since he'd said he didn't think he would out-qualify George Russell all year. Now, it's almost like he's psyched himself out. It's 8-1 in qualifying to Russell so far this year out of 9 races. And actually, what's different about that is this year, also the margin between them is much bigger. So it's still only just over a tenth of a second, by the way, on average between them, even though it's 8-1 to Russell. So it's still quite close. But the last 2 years, there's been basically nothing to choose between them. Hamilton was quicker one year, Russell was quicker the other in terms of the head-to-head. And the margins between them were, I think one year it was like 500ths or something. And last year it was a few thousandths of a second. So to go from those margins to over a tenth, that's, even though it's only just a tenth, it's still quite a big swing. And it's almost like he was basically saying in Canada, do you know what? My head's just not been in the right place. And you could understand why, actually, if you think about it from his point of view. You know, last summer, let's not forget, he signed a new contract with Mercedes. 6 months later, he tore it up and signed for Ferrari. And now he's got a whole year driving for Mercedes, and the car hasn't been competitive. Okay, it got competitive in Canada for the first time, but other than that, it was another disappointing Mercedes car. You could understand how in that situation, age 39, his head's already halfway to Italy. He knows actually he's got a big challenge ahead of himself in Italy because he's got to assimilate with a new team, a new culture, a new language, and he's got, as Jolene was just saying, potentially the quickest driver on one lap in Formula One as his teammate. He's got to go in there and he's got to be Lewis Hamilton, you know, in inverted commas, and they've signed him for a reason. They've signed him to be Lewis Hamilton and everything that means. So you can imagine why he might already be sort of half thinking about that and why he might find it hard to focus on this year. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but to have him admit after Canada that his head wasn't in the right place, that was really interesting for me. And I think that in itself probably explains the performance gap between him and Russell.
I think there's more to it. And I can't put my finger on exactly what this is, but Hamilton last year was one of the best drivers in the field. Finished in the top 3 in the championship. in the Mercedes that still wasn't a particularly good car, but he was very consistent. His qualifying was neck and neck with George Russell, but as he got into the races, the gap was consistently there, and he scored a lot more points than Russell. Okay, the contract negotiations over the winter might have destabilised him a little bit, but when you see him going through a race weekend right now, he looks like Lewis Hamilton on a Friday and on a Saturday morning. The free practice laps he was doing in Canada were very strong, and he looked like he was on it. From the first lap in Canada, I thought, Lewis is flying here. Mercedes looked good, but he's in the zone. Similar in Monaco. I thought he could even be a pole threat in Monaco. And then you get to qualifying, and the whole pace just goes missing. From the first lap, he looks like a shell of the driver that was driving so well in practice. On top of that, there's been some sort of cryptic messaging from Lewis in the media saying, I don't expect to be ahead of George anymore in qualifying, and playing everything down. And I can't quite work out what this could be. I know when I was qualifying at Renault, I had an inherent disadvantage some of the time compared to Nico Hülkenberg, where a spec part was one was just a little bit better. The FIA gave out these parts. Renault picked up one that was much better than the other one. They gave it to Hülkenberg. He was a faster driver than me, so naturally Hülkenberg kept it. But it exaggerated the difference between us, and I couldn't say anything because I didn't want to alert the FIA to this. And then they would take that off Hülkenberg because it was technically too good a part. And so you sort of have to just swallow it, and that's sort of tough, but it's how it goes. And in the end, the FIA did take it away from Hülkenberg. But I don't think that's the case with Lewis, because the way that he's going so quickly through practice, it doesn't feel like that it's such a consistent thing. Obviously, Mercedes are not going to be putting more fuel in his car or not running him in the optimal state, because it only hurts the team. So I can't work out what it is, but I feel like there may be something in play, because the difference from last year to this year, for a driver that's achieved as much as he has, it's a bit strange.
We'll find out sooner or later, because once he leaves Mercedes, if anything odd has been going on, he'll say once he leaves. He won't say while he's there. I agree with Jolyon, though. There's no way that they're sabotaging him or anything like that. It's a ridiculous suggestion that some people are coming out with. But it is true to say that it's slightly odd.
I found it really interesting speaking to Lewis after qualifying in Monaco. He was so down, and it's unusual to see him as down as that without him having made a mistake, or he can't say what happened in Monaco. He doesn't understand it himself. He might do now that he's gone through all the figures and numbers and all the data, but he couldn't tell me what exactly had gone on. In Canada, it was quite clear he had a terrible qualifying. He made mistakes, and that put pay to his weekend. It wasn't perfect. But Monaco was strange, and even he said it was strange. You get the feeling that, well, you say, oh, it's not sabotage. Of course, Mercedes wouldn't do that. I absolutely agree. But something is definitely going on with him and his qualifying performance, and then his race performance is uncompetitive or at a disadvantage because of that qualifying.
Yeah, it does. It just feels a bit strange. Maybe it's simply a case of Russell staying at the team, Hamilton's not. George knows he's got to lead the team in the future, and he's found a little bit more within himself. Another season at Mercedes, and as Lewis is thinking about a couple of other things, obviously moving to Ferrari and the big challenge ahead. Maybe George is choosing this time to really embed himself with the team, and he's got his own future to think about. And if they were very close last year, it could be that George has picked up 1 or 2% in qualifying, and Lewis has lost 1 or 2%, which naturally moves it towards Russell. But I mean, at this stage, then you got to think the job that Russell's doing on Hamilton right now, he is a future champion. People could say he's a future champion anyway, but the way that he is really blitzing Lewis every weekend in qualifying, consistently ahead, looks like the main guy. This is a Lewis Hamilton that not 6 months ago, let's call it 8 months ago now, was one of the top 3 drivers in everyone's pecking order for last year. Was still, you're thinking this is Lewis at the top of his game. And now either Russell's stepped up and he's taken his level on, Lewis has dropped back, or there's something else that's under the radar in play.
It's actually, for all of the chat about Verstappen running away with this championship, if you look behind him, the gaggle of drivers that actually are able to raise their games, that are vying for wins, that are really competitive, is amazing. And I think more drivers are in that top band now than have been there for a long time, Andrew.
There is a really good mix of drivers in Formula One at the top now. You've got Hamilton, Verstappen, Leclerc, Norris, Russell, Piastri, all of them really high quality drivers. It's one of the strongest fields I think probably there's ever been. And I think that's why the races have been so exciting this year. Once the cars get close and you have drivers of that caliber racing closely together, it's going to provide great action, and that has been the case so far.
Which brings us full circle to why Sergio Perez isn't right there with Max Verstappen, because the cars are getting more competitive, and the drivers you look at the Ferraris, you look at the McLaren pairings really strong. You've got Fernando Alonso still in the Aston Martin. The Mercedes pairings obviously incredibly strong. It's a competitive field. Talking
about competitive fields, where is Carlos Sainz going to end up? I suppose the wheels are going to stop turning at some point, and everyone else is waiting for Sainz's contract to be announced so that they can filter out into the remaining places. But there's still a lot of drivers without seats and contracts, Andrew.
Well, Sainz says he hasn't yet decided, but it's coming to the point where he's going to. He says he's going to do it in the next few weeks. I suspect he says he hasn't made the decision. We know it's between Williams and Sauber, which is becoming Audi in 2026. And I honestly don't know which way he'll go, because you can make a convincing argument. Obviously, neither of them are a particularly great prospect for him after leaving Ferrari. He knows he's going to be taking a slide down the grid for next season. But I think you can make a case for either of those teams being a better competitive prospect for the next 2 or 3 years, and not be sure. And the fact that the rules are changing at the end of next year just makes that choice even more complicated. Obviously, on the face of it, you would think Audi is a more appealing prospect because they're a manufacturer. But, Audi are also new to Formula One and a whole new engine formula. So and Sauber have a long way to go to catch up. They're the slowest car on the grid this year. So you might think, if you're just looking at it as a short-term prospect, maybe he might go to Williams. But actually, Williams isn't in that great a shape either. So I honestly don't know what he's going to do, Jenny. But it's true that once he makes his decision, then I think all the other drives will start to fall into place.
Jolyon, which would you choose then, Williams or Audi Sauber?
I think logically, if you asked me at the start of the year, I would have said Sauber and Audi is the obvious place, but Sauber just looks so dismal at the moment. And I know with Audi coming in, there'll be a fresh momentum, but he's got to drive this car for next year. You forget that Sauber have been in the race for the last 2 weekends. They've been hopeless. Drivers have been off. They've had no pace at all. They were starting from the pits in Canada. They were that poor. And Sainz has got to be looking at that thinking, I've got to go for a Ferrari race winning to this. Even for a year, you're thinking that is turgid. Then you look at Williams, who were also in a mess at the start of the year, but Albon's found a bit of form. And you think, actually, a Sainz-Albon team in a Williams, could they become almost a midfield team? There would be a bit of momentum there with those two. I think none of them are long-term prospects really for him, but what's going to give him the best chance to bounce back into a possible Aston Martin seat, a Mercedes seat? Not Sauber right now.
Williams with Albon and Sainz as a pairing. Surely that's nice. That driver performance outweighs the car performance by a long way.
But where are the bad drivers? I don't think Alpine have got a bad lineup with Gasly and Ocon. I think that's a palatable lineup in the midfield. I think Hülkenberg and Magnussen's a palatable midfield lineup. I don't think there are sort of tail-end drivers in tail-end seats anymore. Bottas is a race winner. He's charging around at the back of the field at the moment. That's why I think it would be a coup for Williams, though, to have that line. It would be their strongest lineup for an awfully long time.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're running out of time. Any other business from either of you? Anything that you desperately wanted to get off your chest ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix?
Well, let's just bear in mind, Jenny, this is the penultimate Spanish Grand Prix at Barcelona, in case people have forgotten. It's the race is moving to Madrid in 2026.
Is that going to excite you more, Andrew?
Well, look, I like going to Barcelona.
I like going to Madrid.
But yeah, Madrid is also nice. It's not, as Jolene was saying at the beginning of the show, it's not the race that everybody sort of, rubs their hands together with glee about. It's not Spa or Monza or Austin or anywhere like that. So I don't think it's going to be massively missed, the Circuit de Catalunya. But it doesn't provide great racing either, does it? So it's had a good innings. Maybe it is time to move on.
No, I think we're going to miss it once it's gone.
Oh, do you really? Why?
It's been such a feature of Formula One life for 3 decades more. I don't know. It feels like a coming home when you go to Barcelona. We know all the layout of it. You know the stench of the abattoir coming from turn 16. We're going to miss it. We're going to miss it and all its industrial self.
Right, gentlemen, you are dismissed. Thank you very much. You can listen to the Spanish Grand Prix on 5 Live from 2 p.m. this Sunday. We've also got some exciting news. There's a brand new way you can enjoy your F1 coverage via your smart speaker. All you need to do is ask BBC Sounds to play this weekend's Grand Prix, followed by the session. So, let me give you an example. Ask BBC Sounds to play the Spanish Grand Prix Practice 1. Or you could even try asking BBC Sounds to play the Spanish Grand Prix qualifying. And there we go. It's as simple as that. You have been listening to an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.